Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to this ICT4D seminar. We have a number of presenters here today. That's Ulrika Kleiner from Royal Holloway, University of London. And there's John Traxler from Wolverhampton University. And there's Rahul De from Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. And there's Mao Xin from Agri University in Kristiansand in Norway. And they're going to, each of them are going to do a presentation here, but there's also going to be a discussion afterwards. So we start with a short presentation by these people, and after that questions and also a general discussion. So first is Sophia. So please, the floor is yours, and you can do a better introduction of yourself than I do. So please.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Alke and Annika and the team for inviting me here to Oregon University for both days actually. We had a lovely evening last night, and hopefully the seminar is also going to replenish our energies after what was a lovely evening. Also, clearly, lots of Swedish people speak fantastic English, so I will be talking in English. I hope that's okay. If at any point there are things for clarification, please feel free to stop me, because my Swedish is terrible. So I hope that's all right. One particular passive word is maybe useful to learn. It's I was volunteered to go first. It's a passive construction, so my colleagues decided that I was volunteering to go first. But I think with your help, with you also being energetic, even though it's first thing in the morning, I don't mind at all. So here we go. I get a chance to first talk a little bit about my work, and then we've got time for questions. And then my colleagues will be talking and presenting, and at the end we'll be having a discussion together. Okay. My work is generally based at the UNESCO Chair and the Center for Research in ICT4D, where I'm doing research, but I'm also director of a master's program there in ICT and development. So it's actually quite nice how teaching and research fits together there. My specific research interests are in information and communications technologies for development, ICT4D usually for short, in applying the capabilities approach as a perspective on development. I teach on development theory, and that's a particular perspective that I use. And also I have research terms in ethical consumption, production, value chains, and so on from economic geography. Sometimes these things overlap as well. For those of you who are not familiar with the capabilities approach, it is rooted in the works of Amartya Sen and others who have worked on it. Amartya Sen is an Indian Nobel Prize winning economist and philosopher. He published a famous book, Development is Freedom, in 1999, but has been working on this approach for decades. He talks about development as the process of expanding the real freedoms that people enjoy, focusing particularly on people's capability to choose the lives they have reason to value. And really fundamentally, this for me gives me an anchor point for a lot of my thinking around development. It's effectively about the lives that people themselves have reason to value. It's a decentralized vision of development. And central to this is people's choice, individuals' choices about their lives. So effectively what we're looking at is an approach that is thinking about development not in a linear way, but in a systemic way. That means that we need to think about agency and structural elements, although that's not the language that Sen uses himself very much. From an econocentric, probably orthodox view of development, which is still, I would say, the mainstream perspective of most agencies in the development studies, and particularly development practice and development funding. to a more holistic perspective, and the HDI, for example, includes such things as education and health, but arguably doesn't go far enough in terms of expanding our idea of development. And from a supply-led to much more of a choice-led perspective. Now, the capabilities approach is obviously, for many of us who feel quite liberal in their values about how people should be the authors of their own lives and have choices over their own lives, is a very attractive perspective. It's very theoretically rich, but for practical reasons, it's got some real issues. And one of the reasons why funders, for example, have issues with the capabilities approach is not so much theoretically, but possibly as well, but it's also in terms of the practical application. And there's, I would argue for this talk, two in particular. There's operationalization, so how do you get this conceptual richness translated into practice? And then secondly, controllability. How do you know when you give people, choice-led, if you give people more possibilities to act on their choices or expand their capabilities, how do you know what they're going to choose? So, in a sense, also which funding pot are you going to put it in? Is it going to be the agency responsible for education that will get the credit, or will it be the agency for health that will get the credit? There's some real issues about controllability there. And what I'll argue is that, at least for me, I'm focusing on the first challenge, on operationalization, because for me controllability is one of the inherent issues that's up for debate in the approach. So, with new ICTs, for example, part of the immense power of ICTs for development is their multi-purpose nature, and the ability to both enforce existing structures and disrupt them. And we can't yet predict exactly what people will be doing with them. That will have negative and that will have positive outcomes. And who defines what's negative and what's positive? So there is an element here in how we as ICT4D researchers have a particular interest in keeping the space open for unintended outcomes, because the technologies we work in basically have that capacity for unintended outcomes. So controllability, I would argue, is something that we need to question fundamentally. So I'll focus on operationalization in particular. I'm using here a very simplistic diagram, but hopefully a useful one, where effectively you can classify different technology or bundles of technology by looking at how open or how closed-ended they are in their purpose. And it's just sort of opening a sort of a mental map in how you could classify them. It's a continuum in that most technologies can be altered and are malleable to some degree. But from a capabilities approach perspective, it's important that people remain to some degree in charge of their choices, even when they're using technology, in their use choices and what they achieve with their use. And that means that from a capabilities approach perspective, the more closed that continuum already is, and how fixed the purpose of the technology is, the more you need to involve people in the design of that technology in order to have integrated their choices further down or further along. Okay? So, talking about operationalization, there are different kinds of frameworks in development. I'm showing you here one that I've been using, Alsop and Heinsohn's idea of empowerment, their process of empowerment, which explicitly includes agency and structure as core elements that influence degrees of empowerment. And here they list the existence, use and the achievement of choice, to which I add the sense of choice, and then development outcomes that result from it. It's a very simple sort of idea of the process, but importantly it includes structure. There's the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, which I also use, and which others have also been using in the context of the ICT4D work. And you can see here that in particular this livelihood asset is something that I draw on, the livelihood asset idea. This is kind of a tool that I use, the choice framework, in my operationalization work. And effectively what it kind of shows you is that what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to use some existing frameworks and development studies to come up with a way of mapping the capabilities approach in ICT for development. And in particular, I'm looking at different elements of structure. I'm looking at agency of the individual, degrees of empowerment, development outcomes. You can see the echoes of Alsop and Heinsohn. You can see the echoes of the livelihood framework here. Importantly, in the case of the structure, yes, immediately when we think about social structures, we would think about existing institutions, discourses, policies, formal, informal laws, and here I include in particular also informal laws on the use of space and use of time, which come up in my work in ICT4D. And then also in the case of technology, the aspects of access, such as availability, affordability, and the skills needed for ICT. So these are essentially the structures that the individual needs to navigate. Then you've got the individual's agency. And here we can talk about the different resources that a person has here. This is quite an extensive research diagram which goes beyond the development of the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, and that it shows non-material resources, including, for example, psychological resources such as resilience or creativity, information. It talks also about cultural resources, the narratives that are told both collectively and individually. It talks about time. It talks about geographical resources in terms of what are the spatial layouts and what that means, but also as well spatial in the terms of the constructed space, if you want, beginner's loci, the idea of what can happen in a space just because it's a social space where people come together. And then classic resources such as social resources, natural resources, there's financial resources, obviously educational resources and health. These are the kind of classic DFID approved sustainable livelihood framework resources. And these resources basically are mediated through the personal factors such as age, gender, ethnicity, and these are basically the basis of an individual's agency using the structure. And then out of that, when they navigate the social structure, they can make their choices in that way. You can, again, if choice is what you're focusing on, you can fine slice that as well. And then the development outcomes, in line with Zen's work, the primary development outcome would be choice itself. And then secondary outcomes, we don't know. It depends on what the individual wants. And then, for example, it might be easier communication with friends and relatives. It might be increased knowledge. It might be income increase, mobility, and so on. Those outcomes at that point then become achieved functionings. But at the point of whether or not the choice exists, they are capabilities. So that's how this kind of maps through. This all sounds quite theoretical, so let me kind of show you some examples of how it kind of pops up in my work. And please remember that this is, either a crazy or a potentially useful way of kind of trying to actually map the process holistically. It might be entirely overambitious, or it might be useful. I don't know. I'm still finding out. But what's important is that however you use it, or I use it, or anyone uses it, it would have to be focusing on particular aspects that are relevant to the particular case. In particularly, I would say that you can use it to deconstruct ideologies that are embedded in technologies, that you can use it for systemic mapping of individual cases, and you can potentially also use it as planning for choice. in both an ontological and methodological way. I'll briefly talk about the ideologies and deconstructing them. So the example was, for me, was the Chilean Agenda Digital, which was effectively one of the earliest comprehensive ICT4D state strategies or national strategies in Chile, starting from 2003 onwards, and it effectively covered a whole plethora of national policy. And the ones I particularly looked at were the telecenters, were e-government applications, particularly the new procurement system, and also some of the IT training courses. Key findings of the works included, for example, that micro-entrepreneurs did benefit from the free courses, from free telecenter access, that there were gendered norms that prevented women from using, for example, cyber cafes, particularly in the evenings, that micro-entrepreneurs struggled with the procurement system on two levels. One was the access issue, and secondly, how to compete in an online procurement market that had become, by the very structure of it, more competitive on price. And finally, the shift to e-procurement effectively meant that procurement moved away from the local level into technically national competition. If you deconstruct that in terms of ideology, you would have to look at the goals of the different programs. And even though it was a state policy that covered, Agenda Digital was a national ICT strategy that supposedly was implemented by one government, it was effectively lined up with some government ideas which came from different sections of that center-left field. Social inclusion and equal opportunity were the basis of what the telecenters were about. There was a social equity model embedded, and these happened to be also multi-purpose technologies. Chilecompra was focusing particularly on transparency and efficiency, and indeed also implicitly was interested in increased competition, because that's how efficiency would be achieved. It was very much aligned with a neoliberal economic model that the center-left government of Chile was embracing. It was also, because the way it was set up, it was very much focused in its purpose, and it was heavily directed choice mechanism. And my main objection to Chilecompra is not its kind of ideas about what values should be embedded in the technology or not, but that there wasn't any public discussion about how this very powerful tool would be implemented and what effect it would have on people's livelihoods, and particular livelihoods of the more marginalized people in Chile. And we don't have time to go into systemic mapping in great detail, but just to say that you can take individual cases and literally take it step by step through the different elements of the framework. I personally find that useful in in-depth qualitative work. And then looking at planning for choice, if you want my experience with action research, usually multidisciplinary, with computer scientists and IS people. And there my example is the Fair Tracing project, which effectively was about using mobile phone technology to give ethical consumers or ethically minded consumers in the UK more information about the value chains of particular fair trade products. So it was, how can we design a system which could give consumers and to give producers as well more information, so that they could make more informed choices. If you want designing for choice, planning for choice. So you had to map the value chains for those two products. And then this is 2007, so at the time scanning barcodes with a mobile phone was pretty new. So you would actually be able to scan the barcode on your smartphone and get all this enriched information from there. I always kind of have to date this, because increasingly this has become so commonplace. I guess that's a good idea, or a good thing, because it means generally, at least in terms of technology, there's all the opportunities are there. this was an initial interface design which just kind of shows the different elements that of information that you could give consumers. Work with producers, gather the information, also asking what they want. So you can put, if you want, these 3 examples on a determinism continuum, where the telecenters are probably the most multi-purpose technologies, Chilicom for the most focused. In fact, tracing was fairly focused. But what I'd like to point out is that we did do these kind of participatory design workshops with the producers, and indeed also had here at the Science Open Day discussions one-on-one with people and users about the interface of different kinds of interfaces and what they sought to achieve. And the accompanied shopping that we did here gave rise to the system. So we did design and create in written participatory processes. I'd just like to flag up my current project, which just started this 1st October, which is effectively seeing how ethical consumption is constructed in the minds of Chileans and Brazilians, and actually asking questions about the procurement processes that are being used for the $63 billion US procurement budgets of those 2 countries. There's a move towards using environmental and social criteria in that process, and there's a possibility of maybe having more participatory discussions around how those systems might be designed, these new e-procurement processes. So, to wrap up, basically those are the 3 ways I can see how this might be used. And I've got a few challenges here which I'm happy to take on questions, particularly issues around how do you relate to funders, both in evaluation and in selling your kind of future ideas ways. And finally, consequences for ICT4D research and practice. So first of all, moving away from the linear to more systemic approaches, which I think fits quite nicely to ideas around iterative design. So this would fit well for multi-purpose technologies, and also understanding that these technology will have unintended consequences. Obviously, for me, is the kind of ongoing issue about operationalization, resisting the issues around controllability, and looking at mechanisms, particularly participation mechanisms, that are already existing in development studies, some of them like participatory budgeting, emerging from the Global South, and seeing how these could be applied in issues around participatory design, for example. So that's currently the work that I'm doing. I've got, for this presentation, there's 2 related papers that you might be interested in there. And the work on Chile in particular is coming out as a book with MIT Press in next year, autumn catalog. So hopefully you'll find those interesting. And for any of you who are interested in the master's program, I've also got some flyers here. But I've given you a lot of kind of examples, information, and theoretical ideas, so I'd be very interested in your comments or questions. Thank you.
Okay, a few minutes for comments and questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question about, you say you don't know if the operationalization is going to work or makes sense. How do you test your operationalization? Do you understand a test or validate, or how do you work with that?
Sure. For me, I think one of the key things is to understand whether the operationalization fits with the purpose of the original theory. So the test has to be whether, for example, the idea of choice, the idea of freedoms, the idea of capabilities is still there once I'm actually done with my operationalization and checking through the actual methodology that has been designed. Yeah. So it's basic that would be kind of, if we want in qualitative terms, a validity test throughout. And I think that would be my main criteria. And obviously the fine-tuned methodology that comes after the choice project, where you go for how do you define, say, educational resources, where you have to kind of design a system that's appropriate for the particular educational system in that particular country, for example. That's another step in operationalization that has to be locally appropriate.
Okay, any more questions or comments to this? Then we'll move on. One more?
No, I have 10 or 15, but I can wait.
One more then, one more.
Yeah, and also the capability approach is a holistic and systemic alternative. But what other alternatives that are holistic and systemic are there, as you can see, instead of capability approach?
Well, let's say you can ask that question on different levels, but ontologically, if you're looking at basically where you get alternatives to the extreme dominance of sort of, if you want, economic growth, as it's a mega discourse at the moment, and it continues in development studies to be this kind of the major paradigm. So I would say I would include all theories that accept sort of economic growth plus, or indeed, hang on, we need to look beyond economic growth. And in fact, our masters has been going since the mid-90s. It's talking about practicing sustainable development. In module 1, we need to basically discuss whether economic growth can make sense in a world of limited resources. And fundamentally, I think there's going to be a lot more challenges, in terms of the sustainability issues. I mean, green sustainability here. Environmental approaches, if you want deep green approaches, that will challenge that economic growth paradigm as well. So I can see a lot more holistic approaches coming more generally as we move into post-peak oil, post-water peak, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. There will be more discussion after all the presenters. So, are you next for home? Yes, good. I forgot to say something. There is coffee in the corner.
Now you're
There will be no coffee break.
Is it fair trade coffee?
I'm not sure.
I think it is actually.
If you want coffee, you can pick it up at any time, for instance, while Rahul is queuing up for some break. So, as long as it lasts, there's coffee. Ja.